Let's begin. So this morning we're on week 4 out of 6, looking at an intro to archaeology. If you haven't been able to be at some of the other ones, they all were live streamed, so you could head home, and I think it's better to be here in person myself, but you could always go home and watch this online as well there and catch up. So if you look at the backside, stuff we've talked about already, just kind of an intro. What are the limitations, the benefits? Week 2 was a history of archaeology, and then there's a lot of stuff where it's been written down. Hieroglyphics, cuneiform, ancient Hebrew, there's some really cool things that have been found with writing on them. Last time was 2 weeks ago. Just to watch out that sometimes people are very anti-Bible in their bias or pro-Bible in the bias in a way that's not good, and just to be aware of that and watch for it. We talked about cities, that there are all these layers of a tell. You destroy the city, you build the next city on top of it, and you can have like 20 or 30 layers built up over hundreds and hundreds of years as this heap of ruins for a city. We looked at Jericho a bit last time too. So before I begin today, anything you've had in your minds from the last 3 times you want to follow up with a question about? Then let's begin with a prayer this morning and jump into topic number 4. Lord God, it's amazing how you have been with your people. Year after year, generation after generation, century and millennia after millennia, you are the one who guides and supports and protects us. And so as we look back so long ago at the people who lived at the time of the Bible and the things that they did and how you were with them, I pray that you'd give us a confidence too that says you're the same God who will still guide and support us today. Amen. So for today, the plan is, first of all, to look at what does ideal, good archaeology look like. A couple of you have asked questions about this in the past. So I'm going off of Professor Brug's book for a lot of this class. On page 163 in his book, he gives a list of 10 things that all need to come together if you're going to have the ideal archaeological dig. So the list is on the page. Let me talk through it and show you some pictures. Step 1 would be that you've got to find a site, which means surveying all the different options out there. So if I said to you, hey, why don't you pick a site to do archaeology on, you're probably going to say to me, I have no idea what's out there. What are the options? So step 1 would be being familiar with, let's say, I don't know how many it is, thousands of different places where it's on a map saying, here's a spot where we think there's some ancient stuff buried. So step 1 would be being aware of all of that. Step 2 would be researching and knowing the history behind that spot, and has anybody else done anything there? If so, what did they do? What did they find? Because you want to be able to predict, if I go and dig here, here's the kind of stuff I'm going to find. If you want to find something from the time of the judges, you're going to go to one site, not another. If you want something from the time of the Romans, you'll go somewhere else. And what you're going to see with this whole list, it's the kind of stuff that takes a lot of careful work and a lot of training and quite a bit of money to do, even though there's no profit in the end. So it's going to be easy along the way to take shortcuts and not do a thorough job with any of these steps. And that's where, I suppose, if you're a good archaeologist, you know, here's where I don't have to be quite as thorough. Here's where I do have to be thorough. That step, could you just jump in and start digging without doing your background history stuff? You probably could. But ideally, you're going to know everything you can about that site before you even start planning it. Step 3, you got to get permission. Again, bad archaeology, I suppose you could just go wherever you want and do whatever you want. But sometimes getting permission is going to be very hard because it's going to take permission from the government and other people in the area to okay the project. Step 4, there isn't going to be a profit you're making doing this. So it's more the nonprofit type setup where you've got to get funding before you start. You've got to write grants, you've got to talk to people who are interested in promoting the archaeology you're doing. So in the past, you'll find Christian groups that have sponsored archaeology. You'll find universities that have sponsored it or museums. In our area, I don't know how much you want to, are you totally into this class with me, or is it kind of like, let's get over this and done? I don't know. But if you were totally geeked out by this and wanted to do something like go on a field trip, we could go down to the University of Chicago. They funded a lot of archaeology over in the Middle East in the last century or two. So at the University of Chicago, there's the Oriental Institute, where they have a small museum there of stuff that they've found. And the reason that they have a lot of artifacts there is the university paid for a lot of archaeology to happen. So they're the ones who are the benefactors for it. So step 3 would be, that's 4. 4 would be making sure you've got enough money to fund the project. Step 5, staff, equipment, accommodations. There are a lot of logistics to figure out. So if I say I want to be an archaeologist, it's not just I'm going to go by myself and go dig somewhere. If you're the one in charge of the expedition, there's a lot of stuff to figure out. So on that list, a staff, it takes a lot of people. I haven't heard of any archaeology robots they've invented yet. That all this digging and scraping and combing through the evidence is done by people. And a lot of that, to save money, is by volunteer. So you'll organize a group of volunteers who are so interested in this, and if this is you, you could probably find one, where if you'd pay for a plane ticket over to Israel and pay for your own accommodations for a couple weeks, there's probably somebody who would invite you to come along and work with them on their dig. So you're coordinating all these people. You've got to have the equipment in place. All those people need a place to stay. They need food to eat, so you need to work out all of that ahead of time for this group of people who are there. Number 6, scouting the survey site, having a plan. So if you have, let's say, 50 people working with you, you don't show up and everyone says, hey, what do we do today? And you have no plan. That you've got everything laid out for what you're going to do. Number 7, carrying out a number of seasons of careful digging. And I think, notice that the word season is plural. If you'd look at any of these major excavations, it's not just a month or a year. Some of these, you commit like a decade to working on the site if you really want to do a lot and do a thorough job. Number 8, keeping very accurate records. So let me pause here and put some pictures up on the screen. Here's one from an archaeological dig in Iowa, which I don't know how much you think archaeology happens around here. Someone made the comment last time we had a class of, there's a lot of archaeology in our area too. My neighbor down the street from me, I live kind of by Rock Lake, and they were just talking with me, and they said they had to hire an archaeologist this summer because they have a building project at their house they want to add on, but the We Energy can't actually move the gas line until they have an archaeologist sign off that there aren't any Native American burial mounds where this gas line is going to be run. Which, how many of you would have that on your mind as a box you got to check off before you would complete your house expansion? So she said, yeah, they had to hire an archaeologist to come to their house here in Lake Mills and to do a survey of their land. And do they have Native American burial mounds on their land? Yes. They were thankful that it didn't actually get in the way of what they had planned to do. But this idea that there's archaeology happening, this is not just something in Bible areas. So here are some archaeologists working in Iowa. Now you can see from that they've laid out like this checkerboard. They're not digging everywhere. They take a square and they dig down in that square. And they've got survey stakes set up so that first they're going to use survey equipment to say, what's the elevation of all these different survey stakes? So that as they dig down, they can go off those stakes to have an exact spot horizontally and vertically for whatever they find. So on the sheet here, Professor Brugge said the standard that he was used to is you use 5 meter square. Looks to me like that's maybe a little bit smaller squares they're using there. But if you imagine you lay a grid over the whole site that's 5 meters in a block, and then you say, we can't dig all the blocks, but you got to say we're going to dig this one and that one, and based on what we find, do we do the one next to it, or would we jump over there if we're not finding anything here? But ideally then, you're recording everything that you're doing on that site. Here's another one. This was from a dig in Spain back in 2008. It's trying to show a lot, so it's kind of small, but what do you see going on there that if you were in charge of this project, you would have had to arrange ahead of time? You're seeing equipment there. Let me zoom in on the middle. Computers are a little dated, but you got all this electrical equipment and computers that need to be there. You think wiring, power, all that kind of stuff. I didn't count the number of people, but archaeology is very labor intensive, and so here they must have, 20, 30 people all working there? The bottom of the picture, this is actually up on like a cliff, so they've had to arrange to have scaffolding built up over that whole cliff, and then you got people actually working down underneath there as well. Up on top, this one, they actually built a roof over it, I suppose, so that if it rains, it doesn't erode anything that they're working on. The workers probably appreciate, too, if this is really hot and sunny, getting a little shade as they work under there. But if you think through all of the stuff that was set up to make that scene possible, my guess is that is not just one person. This is probably a fairly large group effort to arrange everything to make that day work on site. So step 8, as you're working like this, you keep very accurate records. So we found this. Here's the grid it was in. Here's the level it was in. Because the goal is to have everything then be by layers as you analyze the site. Step 9, everything gets packed up, you go back home, but you're not done yet. If you want to do a thorough job, there's going to be a lot of preservation and restoration, analysis of all the material you had. So you've got all these shattered pots. After you get back can we put some of those back together? To really dig deep into the data you collected and try to have some kind of main pulling it all together type report that you put together. And then step 10 is that you then would publish all the results. Not just as a social media post, hey, we found something cool, but as something that'd be like scholarly level where somebody else would be able to say, I can go back and check your work and see how you analyzed everything and have all that laid out in order. So if you'd have all 10 of those things come together, that's what would be ideal. Next week, we can talk through, there are times it's not ideal. So if you're going to say what is poor or bad or pseudo-archaeology, there, how do you phrase it? But if you start skipping steps in this process, you might lose out on the end result of what you're able to say you found as you dug up the site. Good versus bad? I think that standards have been developed now, so if you compare archaeology in 2022 versus 1922, it's more, everything's been moving in the direction of having a lot more people and having it documented a lot better. But yeah, can you imagine, so somebody dug up, did any of you read those handouts I had from Jericho last time? One of them commented that one of the problems with Jericho is some of these digs were done 100 years ago, and it wasn't to these kind of standards, and it wasn't documented and published the way that a dig would be today. So one of the reasons there are questions about Jericho is you can't go back and redo that dig from 100 years ago. But to your question of what percentage of archaeology today is good archaeology, that's not one I know how to answer. Any other questions or thoughts on that? That's not what I want to spend a lot of time on today. Let's get into stuff connected with the Bible, but just as you're thinking through the process, and if you'd read a report of, hey, they found this with archaeology, then in the back of your mind you'd be thinking, was this somebody who was doing all the right steps to make sure this was documented well? Is a big part in saying, can we put a lot of weight on the results and say we're certain that what they have is right? All right, jumping into something that's more closely connected to the Bible. The main thing I'd like to show you today is water systems, which I don't know if does that sound boring or interesting? Just how much I take for granted that I turn on my faucet this morning and water comes out. Throughout history, and you're seeing it more now there have been some droughts this last decade. You hear stories of people in, doesn't South Africa have this huge water shortage right now? Even like California, they talk about what if that water in Lake Mead dries up? What do we do as a country if we don't have water? That back then, and living over in Palestine, rain does not come all year round. And if you're going to have any kind of, even living as a shepherd, you got to know where you take your sheep for water. But anytime you want to build a city, you've got to have a water supply. And without having pumps and water towers, how do you make that all work? So in your mind, the first thing I'd ask you is if you've got a differentiation between the words cistern and well. Is that something some of you are nodding to that? So going way back in time, the most basic way of getting water would be either a cistern, you've got a pit, and your pit collects water, so that when it rains or it's the wet season, your pit fills up with water, and then you can use that water during the dry season. And there'd be ways where you could try to funnel water into it. Maybe you found a naturally occurring spot that just has a pool of water, even during the dry season. Now you can guess that initially that's going to leach a lot of water down underground. So as they developed these over time, cisterns became more and more complex where they actually would plaster the whole inside, that they were able to make them fairly watertight, so that any water that goes in can stay in there until it's used. The other option would be a well. So a well is when you've got some kind of shaft that goes all the way down to groundwater, and that's a lot more reliable because assuming the level of groundwater doesn't drop, you'll always be able to find water if you go down there. So in the Bible, here'd be some passages that use either wells or cisterns. So Genesis chapter 37, this is Joseph and his brothers. So when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the ornate robe he was wearing, and they took him and threw him into a cistern. The cistern was empty, there was no water in it. Does that kind of help you imagine that story a little better? So Joseph and his brothers are traveling with their herds. They probably know really well where to find water or not. So the time that Joseph gets sold into slavery is during the dry part of the year. They know there's a cistern nearby, and they know it's empty. This isn't the only time that cisterns were used as jails. So if you want to arrest somebody, where you put them in a cistern, because unless you throw a rope down to them, there's no way they're going to get out. Same thing later on, Jeremiah. This is King Hezekiah. They took Jeremiah and put him into the cistern of Melchijah, the king's son, which is in the courtyard of the guard. They lowered Jeremiah by ropes into the cistern. It had no water in it, only mud. And Jeremiah sank down into the mud. So Jerusalem would have had a lot of cisterns. Sounds like a private one in someone's courtyard. When Jeremiah is arrested, they put him there. And the plan is just, he can't preach if he's down there, and eventually someone comes and helps him because they were just going to leave him to die there in the mud at the bottom of the cistern. So anytime you hear cistern in the Bible, think you've got a spot where they collect water so that there's a reservoir when it's dry. But they're not all just small things like this. This is a spot called Masada. Down by the Dead Sea, there are all these cliffs, and it's a really desolate area. Herod said this would be a great spot to build a fortress, and he was right. So he built this spot called Masada. When the Jews rebelled against the Romans came and destroyed Jerusalem. This was the last holdout for the Jews, as some of them went to Masada. You can still see the outline of the Roman camp. They laid siege to this. It took them years to be able to conquer Masada because it's built up on top of this bluff. They actually constructed a ramp all the way up to the top. And by the time they got there, the Jews there committed suicide in a mass suicide to avoid being captured by the Romans, is the history behind Masada. So a place like this, you've got to have a water supply. So part of what Herod designed there is a cistern. And you, if you take the tour there, can go stand in the cistern. The cistern can hold something like 10 million gallons of water. So that even though you're in this desolate area, the Roman army has no water outside, but the people living inside, they can live there as long as they have food. They can live there indefinitely because they've got a water source down in the basement. Or like the temple complex in Jerusalem, it took a lot of water for all the sacrifices and stuff. So underneath the temple in Jerusalem, there are actually all these cisterns where the temple in Jerusalem, Professor Brugge says, can hold millions of gallons of water underneath the temple. They had an aqueduct built at the time of the Romans that took water into the temple, and then it all went underneath the temple into this massive cistern. So you think of massive public works projects back in the Old Testament, a cistern would have been this reservoir for holding water when you had extra. So going back to this picture, other one would be to have a well. But when you're thinking well, you gotta, if that's what you got in your mind, like this wishing well with a bucket, like the Wells bumper sticker, come to the wells, that kind of well, you got to erase that from your mind because that's not really what a well looked back like at the time of the Bible. So a well is you're sinking some kind of pit or shaft all the way down to groundwater. Here's an example of a story that has a well. So at the time of David, there was a civil war between David and Saul's son. David's general's name is Joab. Saul's son has a general named Abner. So in 2 Samuel, Abner, son of Ner, together with the men of Ishbosheth, son of Saul, left Mahanaim and went to Gibeon. Joab, son of Zeruiah, and David's men went out to meet them at the pool of Gibeon. One group sat down on one side of the pool and one group on the other side. So civil war, Saul's son and his general are on one side, David and his general on the other side, and the place they're going to fight a battle is at the pool of Gibeon. So your imagination gets going, and what do you think of when you hear the word pool? I think of like lifeguards and diving boards and like they've got this big lake, and they're by this lake. Here is the pool of Gibeon on the left side there. And the pool of Gibeon today is surrounded by a fence so nobody falls in. Because on the right, that is the pool of Gibeon. In ancient times, they cut this shaft down. It's like 30-something feet wide and 30-something feet deep. And there's a spiral staircase that winds down around the edges. And at the bottom, there's a tunnel that keeps going and goes like 80-some feet underground. So the way this would work is, if it's the rainy season, it's really wet, that whole tunnel floods, and that shaft starts to fill up with water. And that's when it was nice, because then to get water, you would walk down that spiral staircase, you would dip your jar in the water, and you'd walk back up. But when it dries out, again, this is a well, so you've got groundwater below, but in the dry season then, you probably would have had to walk all the way down to the bottom of that pit, and then you'd have to keep walking down the tunnel until you got to where the groundwater was. Then you would dip your jar in the water, you'd walk back up the tunnel, you'd climb up all the stairs, and you'd come back up to the surface. So when they're fighting the civil war by the pool of Gibeon, it's not like there are just lakes all over like in Wisconsin. This would be where they've got a well cut, and it would have been, imagine something like that rather than this like bucket and fairly narrow opening. With that in mind, Genesis 24 is when Abraham sends his servant to go find a wife for Isaac. This is what the servant says. He's recounting the story to Rebekah's family. He says, "Before I finished praying in my heart, Rebekah came out with her jar on her shoulder. She went down to the spring and drew water, and I said to her, 'Please give me a drink.' She quickly lowered her jar from her shoulder and said, 'Drink, I'll water your camels too.' So I drank, and she watered the camels also." This chapter, it just talks up Rebekah. It says she was beautiful. It says just of all the wonderful things about her, one thing is that she was actually willing to help out this stranger by giving him and his camels water. So as you read that and you imagine what a well looked like back then, if you look at line 2, it says, she went down to the spring, which I think for me, what does it mean that she went down to the spring? I think, well, she walked over like a block away and got some water, right? But imagine her actually going down and up and down and up, not just to get water for Abraham's servant, but she uses her jar to go down and up to bring water for all his camels. The woman at the well, Jesus' time, says, give me some of your water so I don't have to come to this well anymore and get water. Just as far as daily chores that really were a grind, getting enough water for yourself and your family took a lot of effort, especially if it's a dry time of year and you're having to go down and back up. So again, that would be what the Bible describes as a well versus it being a cistern. If I pause there, any questions you've got or thoughts? Or keep going? Ginny.
We certainly have a lot of wrong pictures on our mind from pictures in Bible story books. They always show people sitting kind of like that wishing well, sitting at a well like that.
Even like, so the Samaritan woman at the well, how large was that one? They make a big deal. Jacob gave us this well, like the well is a really big deal, and it was, because to cut something into rock like that took a huge amount of effort. So the Samaritan woman at the well, what does it look like when Jesus is with her? You have nothing to draw with, and the well is deep, is her comment. When you talk about the benefit of archaeology, the main benefit is not that this proves stuff. I mean, it's nice to have things line up with the Bible, but like I talked in the first week, the bigger benefit is the more you see stuff that they found, the more it helps you not have a wrong picture in your mind as you imagine things. And with these water systems, this is one where this is totally different than anything I'm familiar with here. Next on the list then is a spring. So a spring would be that the water table actually pushes water out. Usually it'd be if you have a higher area that has water in it, and then there's like a hillside, you could have water flowing out at the bottom of the hill because the water's pushing out from inside the hill. So in like the land of Israel, having a spring nearby is really nice because then you've got a consistent flow of water without having to go down to the water table and get it there. Now the issue is, the next one on the list, a lot of cities then are relying on either a well or a spring for their water supply. But if you want a defensible position, you want to build your city on top of a hill, which is why you have these tells. You don't build your city in the valley because that's easy to attack. You want to build your city up on top of a hill. The problem with that is it's really hard to have water at the top of the hill because the water is usually at the bottom of the hill. So I have Megiddo on the list. Remember last time that the gate picture, someone was nice enough to take a picture of the plaque that's over in Megiddo? So in Megiddo, they've got another plaque that describes the water system. If I zoom in, here's the problem. So the city is built up on top of a hill. The city wall is on the side of the hill. There's a spring of water, which the city needs to survive. But the spring is you have to walk down the hill and into a cave, and that's where the water is. So maybe your first thought is, well, that's a pain to have to walk outside the city into this cave for water every day. But that wasn't the biggest issue. The biggest issue then is if you'd have an enemy army come attack the city, your water supply is outside the city, and if the army cuts off your water supply, there's no way you're going to be able to hold out against a siege without water. So in Megiddo, here's what they did. They dug a shaft. It's a square. It's 80 feet deep, where there are steps going down the shaft, and then it kind of levels out at the bottom. So there's a shaft and then stairs. And at the bottom of the stairs, there's a tunnel that's like 250 feet long that gets to the spring that would have been outside the city wall, but you can get there walking underground through this tunnel. Then they built a wall to block that cave, and they did the best job they could to make it just blend in with the hillside. Because the hope then is that if you have an invading army come in, they actually have no idea that the water source is available there. They'll just think this is part of the hillside, and the people inside Megiddo will be able to still access their water supply underneath the wall through this tunnel. So if you'd go to Megiddo today, wouldn't that be cool? You can walk down the water shaft, and then down the stairs, and then you can walk down the tunnel to get to where the spring of water was, which I think would be really awesome to do once. But if that was what you were doing every single day as your way of having water for yourself and your family, this is the kind of water systems that they had to design and build in ancient Israel. They would have had stairs, but yeah. And I don't know if they had railings. And then imagine that you're carrying then this big clay jar, and the larger the jar you take, the less trips you got to make. But the smaller the jar, the lighter it is. So you think of, the physical effort that went into just providing for your family and drawing water every day would have been a lot of work. I hear stories of even today, like in Africa, there are places where getting water, clean water for your family is like 25% of the household work for the day is just trying to get water. And again, just our world is so different where we've got pumps and pipes. If you understand how water works, that'll help you just realize some things about the Bible stories you know. Here's another one from 2 Samuel. So David now, the civil war's ended. David's the king. He says, I need a new capital city, and I think Jerusalem would be a great place to have a capital. So David's making plans to attack Jerusalem. This is 2 Samuel chapter 5. The king and his men marched to Jerusalem to attack the Jebusites who live there. The Jebusites said to David, you will not get in here. Even the blind and the lame can ward you off. I love the trash talking in the Bible. This isn't the only one where what do you say if you want to trash talk the opposing army? Yeah, even our blind people can fight you off. They thought David cannot get in here. Nevertheless, David captured the fortress of Zion, which is the city of David. On that day, David had said, anyone who conquers the Jebusites will have to use the water shaft to reach those lame and blind who are David's enemies. So how did David's army get into Jerusalem? The Bible says they found the water shaft and climbed up the water shaft and were able to get in without having to go through the defenses, is how David conquered Jerusalem. And you go to Jerusalem today, they argue about Jerusalem has a water system. We'll talk about this a little bit later. But where is the water shaft that David and his men used to get in and conquer Jerusalem? You think for Megiddo, well, yeah. If you're defending Megiddo, you'd have to make sure that you don't have enemy soldiers one day figuring out where that wall is and then sneaking in from underneath the city. By the time you get to the New Testament, have all of you seen pictures of aqueducts what the Romans built? They had aqueducts in Judea. This is the one Herod built to supply water to Caesarea. So the idea of having thousands of people living in the same spot, that takes a lot of water. City sizes would have been fairly small in the Old Testament until they would have developed more expansive water systems like the aqueducts that brought water to Caesarea. Professor Brugge he thought this was interesting. I thought so too. They figured stuff out like, how do you get water across a valley? You know how a siphon works? That if you have an airtight pipe, the water level is going to even out. They knew this in ancient times, so the water's coming in from the left on the higher hill. They figured out that if they had airtight pipes going over the aqueduct in the middle, they didn't have to bridge it on top. They could actually send the water down one side of the valley, and then through a siphon, it would come up the other side of the valley and keep going. Yeah, they didn't have electricity back then. And there's some pretty amazing things we've accomplished in our age, but you look back and say, wow, I don't think I would ever be able to figure out how do you divert a river somewhere else and use a siphon system with airtight clay pipes that would be able to carry water to these cities. Let me pause there. Any thoughts you've had or other stories that come to mind with water in the Bible that say, oh, that's how that works now? Scott?
Water coming in, waste has to go out. Did they do that too?
Yeah, and I did. Do you want the toilet part too?
Yeah.
Yeah? If you read Brugge's book, he goes through, what do you know about what were toilets like? And part of it for the Jews is God had these rules about being ceremonially pure. So I read somewhere that if you wanted to abide by all the Old Testament laws, you'd have to have the toilet be outside of where you live. So imagine it's not just you have an outhouse, the toilets are removed from the residences a ways. What do you do, especially as cities get bigger, what do you do with sewage, and how do you make sure that doesn't contaminate your drinking water? These are the kind of things that you would have to figure out if you lived in ancient times. They didn't have, it wouldn't be everything we have with indoor plumbing, but they had flush toilets way back then, where you'd have clay pipes coming out the bottom of the toilet and you would pour water on the top to flush it. You want more toilet stories? Do you know the story in the book of Judges where Ehud is sent to go to Eglon, the king of Moab, and he assassinates him? What chapter is it? Chapter 11 or something? You have to go back to Judges and read the story. He has this private meeting with King Eglon, and he kills him there. And this is him defending God's people. He sneaks out and gets away. Eglon's servants come in, and they're embarrassed to go in because they think he's using the bathroom, which is interesting because he's up on the second story of his house. So you'd say, this is 1,000 plus BC, and you've got the king of Moab using a toilet on the second floor of his house. Which, is that the thing you have the fifth graders focus on when teaching the story? Probably not, because that's the only thing they'll remember for the day. Chances are this is the only thing you'll remember this morning too, because it's toilet stuff. How is it that Eglon is using a toilet on the second floor of his palace? Is it as a chamber pot where somebody's going to have to take that and dump it outside later? Is it that he had pipes? Even so, Ehud sneaks inside and then he gets away without being caught. The servants are watching. How in the world does Ehud sneak in and out unnoticed? And he also locks the door from the inside. So that's partly why they don't get in either, is the door is locked on the inside. So Ehud somehow locks the door on the inside, kills the king, and then gets away without them knowing. So I guess I've always imagined he jumped off a balcony or something. This is the kind of stuff, it's speculative. How do you know? I read someone said, maybe he sneaked out the sewer pipes. Which, Scott asked for it. If King Eglon had a flush toilet from the second floor, there would have been clay pipes leading out to wherever. It's not like a whole waste processing, but it would have been some kind of pit in the ground outside that it went to. How did Ehud get in and out, and how does King Eglon have this second floor bathroom in his house? This is also, if you go to Jericho, we talked about that last time, I think it happens at Jericho, where this is a time there's really nothing there, and it seems like he had this just as a spot where he could administer the area in Judea, even though Moab is off to the east. Sally, you finding something to add here?
Judges 3:23. He went out to the porch and shut the doors of the open room behind him and locked them.
Yeah, so he's upstairs. What does his porch look like? And Eglon's servants say he's relieving himself. We don't want to go in and bother him. So this allows Ehud to get away because they don't find out what he's done for a while because they're embarrassed to disturb the king while he is on the toilet, they think.
Some of those cities, like the capital stuff, the Romans, they had public baths and public restrooms too, because they bring water in and out. So you would go outside, but it would be a place that you would go with many people all going in the same spot, and that's they move water in and out that way. So it was when you bathed or went to the bathroom, there were public ways of doing that.
Yeah, and I don't know, so you can, from the Roman times, you can see what a public bathroom looked like. I don't know how much the Israelites adopted all the practices of, because that was kind of frowned upon that you're becoming too much like the Greeks and Romans. But yeah, the Roman ones, it's like 30 seats in kind of this U shape, and they had water running underneath them so that would carry away the waste from the toilets. And then there was a channel in front, and there were sticks with a sponge on them, and that's what you'd use to wipe yourself, which you say that sounds gross. That sounds a whole lot better than, I mean, what option would you have that's better than that? The story they tell is that if you were rich back then, and it was winter, you would pay somebody else to go and warm up your seat before you'd go, because that'd be kind of chilly. These are they're like stone seats where you got a cutout in the middle where you sit down and, archaeology is not just gold statues and writing stuff. It's how did life work every day, and a huge part of life is having the clean water you need to drink and then getting rid of the waste in some kind of sewer system.
Going back to the wells, do you know what type of masonry tools, or how did they cut those shafts and cut those stairs in such a, it looks square, and this is obviously, there's been some improvements done, but these were well done and sophisticated.
Save that question a little bit because I've got one more example coming up where it talks through how it would have worked constructing a project like this. This would be an Iron Age, so they'd have iron tools they're using. But yeah, you talk about some manual labor, cutting a channel through bedrock. I think the word that's used I've got one coming up where they use picks. So you got a pick. And it's not just here though, I mean, they're mining for ore. Those are some of the worst jobs, to be a slave, like even in the Greek cities, they had silver mines, and to be a slave down in the mines looking for silver. They did have ways of tunneling and cutting, and just even a couple of weeks from now, we'll look at the temple. Some of the blocks at the base of the temple are some of the largest objects ever moved by human beings without power equipment. And they're just incredibly large. And you say, how in the world did they figure that out? Pyramids, that's even before the time of Abraham. How did they build the pyramids? I guess no one really knows. A massive amount of human labor. What kind of tools would they have had to accomplish some of these projects? All right, we got about 17 minutes left. If you're going to pick somebody in the Bible where just all kinds of things come together, Hezekiah in the Old Testament, reading online too, just the comment is, he has more evidence for his life and reign than just about anybody else in the Old Testament. So are you familiar with who Hezekiah is? He's a king in Judea in the 700s. It was during his reign that the northern kingdom was destroyed by the Assyrians. It's during his reign that Isaiah is the prophet. And the Bible describes him as a very good king who feared the Lord. So on this list, there are a bunch of archaeological things that fit with Hezekiah, including one that has to do with water. So at the top, they've found these impressions made in clay from a ring that mention Hezekiah or people who worked with Hezekiah. And I think one of these lately, it wasn't just, it showed up on the antiquities market, we don't know where it came from. There's one of these actually found in a site that was actually done the right way with those 10 steps I talked about before. So we have evidence that there's a king named Hezekiah who lived. We have some of his seals that have survived. Another thing is that during his reign, their official government-made pottery, because a lot of what he was trying to do was to work to withstand sieges by the Assyrians. And that meant storing supplies a lot of different places. So they find these pots where on the handle, do you see that stamp? There'd be this design that looks kind of like a bird. And then the letters in English, LMLK. Melech is the Hebrew word for king. The letter L means to or belonging to. So Lamelech means belonging to the king. And they've dug up thousands of these pots all over Israel. And remember how pottery can kind of help connect things together and date it? So this would be an example of when you find a Lamelech jug, you can date it to the time of King Hezekiah, and you can kind of see how many jugs was he storing and which cities got more or less. You can try to gauge things about the economy and his preparations based on these jugs. So that's something they found from his time. This is one I showed a couple weeks ago. There's a man named Shebna, the Bible says is working in his administration, who built himself a really fancy tomb. And it seems like we might know where his tomb was, that there's an inscription that fits that. 2 Kings 18 says that he, Hezekiah, removed the high places, smashed the sacred stones, and cut down the Asherah poles. He broke into pieces the bronze snake Moses had made. For up to that time, the Israelites had been burning incense to it. It was called Nehushtan. Hezekiah trusted in the Lord, the God of Israel. There was no one like him among all the kings of Judah, either before him or after him. How about that for high praise coming from the words of the Bible about this man Hezekiah? What did Hezekiah do? He got rid of false worship, and he got rid of worship that wasn't taking place at the temple. God had said, I want there to be one altar. I want there to be one place that I'm worshiped. And throughout the Old Testament, you see that the Israelites claim to be worshiping the true God, but they do it in ways that God had forbidden. So on this list, you know the story about the bronze snake that Moses put on a pole? This is now like 700-800 years after the time of Moses. The people have held onto that artifact and are using it for actually worshiping this bronze snake. Hezekiah comes through and just destroys it. So you think, way to go Hezekiah as far as following the Lord. You can also imagine this probably took a lot of blowback from the people who didn't like that he was changing their local worship practices. So you dig up a place like Beersheba. Again, this is one I showed you a couple weeks ago. There's an altar in Beersheba that was purposefully dismantled and used to build other walls. And what's interesting there is it wasn't destroyed in a war. It was purposefully taken apart. There are other places too, like in Arad. I put that on the list. Arad actually has a miniature temple like the temple in Jerusalem. So you say, how far did this get that people aren't worshiping in Jerusalem? You've got Israelites building their own copies of the temple in their own town and then offering sacrifices to the Lord there and mixing it together with Asherah and some of the pagan deities. So part of what Hezekiah did was to go around and to remove or decommission or destroy anything that was taking the people away from the true worship of the Lord at the temple. So as you dig up these cities, you'll have layers from about the time of Hezekiah where you can see that the worship center was taken apart, like this altar in Beersheba or like the temple in Arad. Now, again, there's not 100% certainty, but does it seem like this would be evidence of what the Bible says, that Hezekiah had this campaign to make sure that it was worshiping the Lord just in Jerusalem? Yeah. Even people who don't believe the Bible is inspired will say, it sure seems like there's evidence that Hezekiah did this kind of stuff. So that'd be on the list of stuff. The main thing Hezekiah did was to try to get ready for the Assyrian attack, because the Assyrians are pushing over. During his reign, the northern kingdom of Israel was conquered. The people were taken into captivity. So, in Jerusalem, there are lots of different walls built at different times. This one's called the Broad Wall, and it dates from the time of Hezekiah. And they call it the Broad Wall because it's like 7 meters wide, so like 21 feet. So if you pace that off, what would that be? Probably like from me to the back wall. This is a fairly thick wall and tall wall. Hezekiah built this wall around Jerusalem because he knew that Jerusalem was going to get attacked. But the one that the Bible focuses on isn't the wall. 2 Kings says, "As for the other events of Hezekiah's reign, all his achievements and how he made the pool and the tunnel by which he brought water into the city, are they not written in the book of the annals of the kings of Judah?" The pool and the tunnel is what the Bible focuses on, and it's very much like the problem in Megiddo. So here's a picture of Jerusalem. We're going to be looking at the southeast corner. So if I zoom in there, do you see the Gihon Spring? That is the main water supply for Jerusalem at the time of Hezekiah. The trouble is that is outside the city wall. So before Hezekiah, they have ways of trying to work with the water, but Hezekiah realizes if the Assyrians come, we've got to have a way of having the water inside the city. But rather than having this tunnel where people have to walk out to the Gihon Spring underground, what he did was he figured out a way to build a tunnel where the water would flow from the Gihon Spring to a new pool that he built. So do you see the Siloam pool? That shows up in the Bible because even at the time of Jesus, they're using this for water. So going with archaeology, in the 1800s, they find this tunnel underneath Jerusalem connecting the spring with this pool. And in the spring, it was really hard to read because it's ancient, but this is ancient Hebrew inscription down underground inside this tunnel. It's called the Siloam inscription. It's not complete. There are gaps in it and breaks, but here's what it says. The tunnel, and this is the story of the tunnel, while the axes were against each other and while 3 cubits were left to cut, the voice of a man called to his counterpart, for there was Zada. We don't know what that word means. It must mean like a crack or a fissure or something. There was a Zada in the rock on the right, and on the day of the tunnel being finished, the stonecutters struck each man toward his counterpart, axe against axe, and flowed water from the source to the pool for 1,200 cubits, and 100 cubits was the height over the head of the stonecutters. So I don't know exactly what these tools would have looked like, but this is like, hurry up, we're about to get attacked. They figure out, and it's such a curve because they didn't just cut straight through. They used natural caves when they could and only cut out the parts they had to. But if you look in the middle, there's kind of a zigzag, and that's because as they got close to each other, the hard part was figuring out how do we tunnel from both sides at the same time and have it meet in the middle. So that inscription talks about what a great day it was when they were able to hear each other actually through the rock, and they were able to complete this, and then they had to level out the floor. So if you go to Jerusalem today, one thing tourists love to do is you can actually walk through Hezekiah's water tunnel. And this is then what brought water into Jerusalem. So when the Bible says Hezekiah completed this pool in the tunnel, that's stuff where you can say, oh, that's what he was doing and why he had to do that, because having a spring outside the city is no good if the Assyrians are going to come and attack. Got a little time left. Here's a map of the Assyrian campaigns into Judea and Israel. They attacked at least 8 different times over about 100 years, kept pushing further and further. During Hezekiah's early reign is when they destroyed the northern capital. Here's the campaign that Hezekiah is worried about. It's the blue line. So they come down the coast. They go through the towns of the Philistines. They go to Lachish, and then they're going to make their way to Jerusalem. So Isaiah chapter 36 says, in the 14th year of King Hezekiah's reign, Sennacherib, king of Assyria, attacked all the fortified cities of Judah and captured them. Then the king of Assyria sent his field commander with a large army from Lachish to King Hezekiah at Jerusalem. When the commander stopped at the aqueduct of the upper pool, again, the water system is really important, so this is where they're talking, on the road to the launderer's field, Eliakim, son of Hilkiah, the palace administrator, Shebna the secretary, and Joah, son of Asaph the recorder, went out to meet him. So Shebna is the guy where his tomb, we think we know where it is. The Assyrians are going from Lachish to Jerusalem to demand that Hezekiah surrenders. Now, in Nineveh, they found a room where Sennacherib made massive wall panels showing him attacking Lachish. the city just down the road from Jerusalem. These are 8 feet tall and 80 feet wide. They wrap around the entire room. And it shows the Assyrians, and this is the caption: Sennacherib, king of the universe, king of Assyria, sits on a throne, and the spoils of Lachish are paraded before him. So what's on there? You see the archers. So there's a depiction of the Assyrian army. In the middle, there's a siege machine with archers on it. Here are Assyrian soldiers taking the people into captivity and slavery after they defeated Lachish. The Assyrians' way of controlling a people was through terror. And doesn't your heart just break when you read stuff from Ukraine where they uncover these terror rooms and torture chambers? That your way of controlling people is by torture. The Assyrians, that was their policy. They had people who were so skilled that they could flay a man's skin off without him dying. So on this relief, you've got Jewish people being skinned alive after being captured. Here's Sennacherib on his throne. So as far as a visual representation, what did a Jewish man look like at the time of Hezekiah? Off on the left side, you see them? They've got kind of curly short hair and beard. The Assyrians got the big long beard and long hair. But as far as a visual depiction of what does a Jewish man look like at the time of Hezekiah, off on the left side, these are the captured Jews from Lachish bowing down before Sennacherib. So everything falls except for Jerusalem. Sennacherib sends his commander to Jerusalem to say, you've got to surrender too. Your God is not powerful enough to save you. You read the Bible accounts, Hezekiah brings this letter into the temple and lays it before God and says, God, look at what these Assyrians are saying about you. And then, you know the story? That night, the angel of the Lord went down and put to death 185,000 in the Assyrian camp. When the people got up the next morning, there were all the dead bodies. So Sennacherib, king of Assyria, broke camp and withdrew. He returned to Nineveh and stayed there. That God stepped in and delivered Hezekiah and the people of Jerusalem. Everything else was destroyed, including Lachish, but the Assyrians never conquered Jerusalem. So then you look at Assyrian records. This is Sennacherib's prism, where he writes about all the great things that he did, and he talks about Hezekiah in this campaign. He claims that he destroyed 46 Jewish towns, and he says, I trapped Hezekiah like a bird in a cage. But he never says that he conquered Jerusalem. And other historians say this too. He claims, I got all this tribute, so I won, because in general, they would never acknowledge any kind of defeat. But this is another one where it lines up, where the Bible says God stepped in and saved Hezekiah at the time of the Assyrian attack on Jerusalem. And yeah, you read from Sennacherib's own records, he did conquer Lachish. He's got that plastered up on the wall of all these great things he did. But he trapped Hezekiah like a bird in a cage, but he never was able to actually conquer Jerusalem. So again, I don't know. I don't think I'm sharing anything with you that you wouldn't already learn from the Bible. But just, I think it's neat when you dig up stuff in archaeology to say, here's what life would have been like for them back then with their water systems, and to say, here's some stuff that lines up with what we know about the story about Hezekiah. And yeah, if you're interested, go home and read. 2 Kings has a part about Hezekiah. 2 Chronicles does. Book of Isaiah does too. Read about his faith in God and the kind of things he did, how God delivered him. One minute left. If you look ahead, next time is kind of this hodgepodge catch-all of all the stuff that I don't know that they all go together, but just to go through a bunch of different areas. I'm hoping, too, that there'll be time to just talk and ask questions and answer them. I know there wasn't too much time today or the last time about that, so if you've got questions, bring them along next time. The time after that to go through New Testament archaeology stuff, what can we say about the life of Jesus, travels of Paul. But let's close today with a prayer. Lord God, you delivered Hezekiah. You You save the ones who trust in you. And I pray today that you would do the same for us, that no matter what's against us in this world, you would guard and defend us. You'd keep us safe as your people and one day bring us to glory with you in heaven. So please bless our day today. Amen.